Hello, and welcome to Continual, the Never-Ending Convention. My name is Jean Marie Ward, and today we're talking Star Wars in honor of May the 4th. This panel is all about a rather unusual aspect of the Star Wars universe, military strategy, specifically a wonderful book called Strategy Strikes Back: How Star Wars Explains Modern Military Conflict. With me today are the creators and writers of that book, Matt Cavanaugh, Jaym Gates, Theresa Hitchens, and Max Brooks. Welcome, everyone. Okay, first up, I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourselves, starting with you, Theresa.
Hi, everyone. I'm Theresa Hitchens, and currently I am the air and space reporter at an online news magazine called Breaking Defense. I've had a kind of mixed up career, both working as an academic and a researcher, including as the director of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, and as a reporter and writer. Currently, for my sins, I'm working as a reporter and writer.
Yeah, it does feel like that sometimes. Max?
Hi, I'm Max Brooks, and I voice the character of Howard Groot in the cartoon Batman Beyond. And that's about it. Oh yeah, no, I wrote some books, like World War Z and Harlem Hellfighters, and I'm a fellow at the Modern War Institute at West Point.
Oh, very cool, very cool. Jaym?
I'm Jaym Gates. I have a background primarily in writing and editing. I was the communications director for the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America for about 5 years. And since then, I've been working in the gaming industry and working as well, consulting a little bit in the futurism and some of the military aspects. Currently, I am involved in a project that's looking at some aspects of ethics in certain areas of futurism that I'm very excited about. So that's about where I am right now.
Cool, cool. Matt?
Hi, I'm Matt Cavanaugh. I'm also with Max, a senior fellow with the Modern War Institute at West Point. I'm an active duty Army officer. So anything that I say is just my own opinion and not those of the Army and the Department of Defense. And then I also teach. So I've got a foot in academia and teaching a master's program at Arizona State University. And then when I get the chance, I hang out with sharp creative minds like this group.
Oh, that's a very kind thing to say, at least in my case. Anyway, Matt, how did the idea for Strategy Strikes Back come about?
So in two places, in a classroom at West Point, where my success rate on jokes with college students was 0.0%. And then also in a grimy, disgusting hotel room in Korea. Both will become clear in a moment. But you know, when you're an older person trying to teach and talk with cadets, 18 to 22-year-old kids, you find very quickly that there's an age gap that's really hard to bridge. And then beyond that, when you leave teaching, as I did, and you go overseas for a military assignment in a headquarters in Korea, you find there's a cultural gap. Americans know a whole heck of a lot about the Civil War or the Second World War, particularly in Europe, right? But Koreans don't necessarily have the same context or background that we do. And so there was this moment, just this hunch really that that Star Wars could be a bridge, something that cadets, colonels, Koreans, and civilians could all come together to have a common terrain on which to have a conversation about modern war. Because in a lot of ways, it's the one war everyone in this world knows something about. It's imperfect. I know some people say it's a space opera, or they have critical remarks about the films. That's fine. But it's almost like a Peloponnesian War for our modern age, because for better or worse, everyone has some familiarity with it. There are aspects of real war sprinkled throughout the films everywhere: blockades, coups, armies, rebels, an empire, special operations, special forces. And so as I was leaving that assignment in Korea, what happens is you get put into sort of a quarantined area for a couple of days. And I was stuck in this terrible hotel room with nothing to do, and literally watched all of the Star Wars films back to back to back. I mean, it was film binging, which is sort of some extreme version of binging. By the time I was done, my eyes were red, but I had filled up books, notes of real elements or aspects of war that you could actually use as a jumping off point in the films. And at that point, while I had a foot in academia, I didn't have any foothold in the creative writing world. And so I reached out to a couple folks that I thought might help refine the idea. One is Max, and the other is August Cole. And through August is how I connected with Jaym, who had worked with August on a previous anthology. And we set about pulling together a team of writers in order to bring some of these ideas into reality.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Jaym, and I'll get to you, Max. What was the first jobs that you guys took on when you entered into this project?
A big aspect for me was pulling together authors who maybe didn't have as much of the military background, but who had the creative side of it. And one of the things that we're really seeing a lot of, and this has been going on for a while back with, ironically, the Star Wars program back, in the 70s with science fiction authors consulting for that. But we have a very rich and long history of creative people working with the DoD, with the military. I actually got connected to August and some of the other things through the DoD reaching out to SFWA back a few years ago to get us involved with the 100-Year Starship Symposium, which is something that I'm still somewhat involved with. And so we wanted to pull in authors who had a fresh perspective. And one of the things that I think I brought to this a little bit was that in War Stories, we had worked with a lot of authors who weren't the traditional military science fiction authors. So we had connections to those, but we also had connections to people who were wanting to look at this in a different way. What is the effect of war on the civilian population? What propaganda, all of these different aspects that aren't always considered, but that are very much a part of war and of the culture around it, for lack of a better term. So that was my thing, was basically, we had a lot of meetings about how this project was going to look, how the timeline should go, what publishers we wanted to look at. So I brought in folks like you and Theresa, but also started consulting on publishers and agents and some things like that, along with Max, who had better connections than I did for that.
Okay, cool. Max, so you were bringing in another set of authors and bringing in possibly the perspective from working on World War Z.
Well, I mean, I think what I brought in the perspective was I was the baby of the bunch, in that these were sort of two groups that I initially didn't have much to do with, because I'm not a joiner. I'm not part of any clubs. I'm not part of any groups, and I don't hang out with like-minded people. But I had outsider's perspective. And what struck me as so brilliant about Matt's idea is the notion that we in this country have divorced ourselves from those who protect us. And that became abundantly clear September 12th, 2001, when President Bush made the speech about praying and hugging your children and participating in the economy. And the more I studied that, the more I realized that that was actually the end of a very long road, not the beginning. Everybody was talking about some sort of big break that happened with that speech, but that speech was not the beginning. This has been happening for generations, to the point now that we are completely divorced. We have a sheep and sheepdog notion of national defense. When I first was asked to speak at West Point, I actually used a science fiction term. I talked about the warrior class becoming a warrior caste. And now everybody's stealing that term, and I'd love to say, but actually, Babylon 5. It was from J. Michael Straczynski's science fiction show, Babylon 5, the warrior caste with the Minbari. Mm-hmm. And I've been fascinated with the notion of how do we reintroduce ourselves to each other, right? How do we come back together and understand that our security is everybody's business and everybody's got a part to play. But before you do that, you still got to be able to talk to one another. And so when Matt said, I want to do this book, I want sci-fi writers to come in, but also active duty military, retired military, people to come in, and everybody will write their stories, and we will discuss strategy through the language of Star Wars. I thought, this guy's brilliant. My God, and yet his hair is so short. So that was sort of my introduction to this.
Mm-hmm. So cool. So let's get into some of those essays. Were there specific goals in the essays before you started inviting the writers in? And anybody jump in here there. I don't know who to ask this question to.
So I'll jump in the sense that we did have to create some rumble strips, some guidelines, right? Because if it's everything, it's nothing. And so we stuck to what was on screen. For the most part, we did allow some dabbling in some of the larger fiction universe from Star Wars. But, you know, if you're aiming at a general reader, then the general common experience that reader will have some engagement with the films. And, you know, one thing that I think was really powerful was when I was running down someone to write a foreword, I asked General Stanley McChrystal, former commander of all forces in Afghanistan, and his initial response was, well, I'm not a huge Star Wars fan, but when I finished Ranger School as a lieutenant, the first movie I went to see was the very first Star Wars film. And so to me, that was perfect in the sense that here's this guy that's decades older than I am, but there's a connection there. And so that's really, in a lot of ways, the whole point. So we stuck to the films, and then we wanted to use moments in the film as a departure point or a jumping off mechanism to connect to bigger ideas in the real world. You know, to use those moments in the films that everyone is so familiar with to shine a light on interesting ideas. You know, and everybody on this panel was able to do that. I mean, Max, for example, used the Ewoks as a jumping off point to talk about why we should send foreign aid to devastated societies. And so that's really what we were looking at. It was a very simple formula, but I think a really effective one.
Okay, great. Okay, Theresa, how did you get involved, and why did you choose the aspect of Star Wars that you did?
Well, I got recruited by Jaym on Facebook. And I'm neither a science fiction writer, nor have I ever been in the military, but I've covered aspects as a journalist of the defense world for a very long time. And then, as I said, I worked at the UN, and in 2017, I guess, when we first started this project, it was published in 2018. I had recently left the UN, where I spent 6 years working on issues related to peace and security from the aspect of norms, setting norms of behavior, and how that intersected with creating whole of government strategies for achieving the goals that you want to achieve internationally without having to resort to the use of force. And looking at military strategists often forget that they are a piece of a greater whole. And that was why I wanted to participate in writing something for the book. I wrote about aspects of Star Wars, but also aspects of the military that cause reoccurring failures. So one is the military is a hierarchical structure, okay? But hierarchies have a tendency to fall toward toxic leadership and micromanagement. And that's something that each of the military services has recognized. They have handbooks that talk about this. You can get disciplined for toxic leadership. Not that it happens
very often.
Yeah, you can actually get disciplined, but it is a failing that can very easily happen in a structure. The other thing I wrote about, for example, is the use of force first and foremost. The choice to use force first and foremost. And lastly, I talked about reliance on legacy technology, which in particular has been a bugaboo of the United States military for a very long time. The problems of developing technologies based on older technologies and not being able to actually, in the end, meet the goals that you want to meet with your actual technology. So there's this reliance on tech. So I wanted to be a part of it because I'm a huge fan of Star Wars. I know you're going to ask that later. It just sounded like it would be really fun to use those sagas as a way to teach some lessons that need to be learned over and over.
Yeah, and we do have to learn them over and over. I mean, what is the truism to the effect of you spend the first couple years of any war killing off the old leadership so you can actually get down to business? I'm putting it badly, but yeah, and I'm thinking as you were speaking of that, there was something at Atlas Obscura about this fort up in New England that basically was based on the needs of the War of 1812. It was built in the 1840s and 50s, and it was basically out of date by the start of the Civil War. So, but fortunately, it was in a part of New England that nobody ever attacked. Okay, Max, Ewoks. Ewoks are the last thing I would have thought as a salutary strategy lesson. What made you think about that? What made you use them as your lens?
Well, I wanted to talk about something that we used to be really good at and something that we now just titanically suck at, which is winning the peace. We used to be masters at that. We understood in the Second World War that once you send in the army to actually win the war, you then have to send in a second army to win the peace. And that was the lesson we took from the First World War, that you cannot go in and wipe out a country and then just walk away. Because if you leave a people starving and angry, their children are going to grow up and seek revenge. And we understood that. We understood after World War II that we had to build a better future.
The Marshall Plan.
The Marshall Plan. And we did the same thing with Japan. We did this all over the world. We were the masters at nation building. And we lost that. I mean, I tend to think that one of the most dangerous people ever, when I read the book Charlie Wilson's War, were people like Charlie Wilson, these adventurers that go and they kick over the anthill because it's exciting and fun, and then they walk away. And we did that in Afghanistan. I mean, looking at Afghanistan, you see that we helped the Mujahideen beat the Soviets, and then we just walked away.
Yeah.
This ancient society that had been utterly decimated, and we used them as a pawn.
Yeah.
And it festered and it turned into chaos. The Taliban came in. But how do you teach that? Right? You do a PowerPoint presentation, you're either going to put people to sleep, piss them off, or scare them away. And I thought, wait a minute, that's Endor.
Mhm.
That's exactly what happened with Endor. That the rebels used the Ewoks as a pawn, drove away the Empire, and then what happens? What's the next day after they finish singing Nub Nub? So I thought that I'm going to use the post-war Endor as a metaphor for Afghanistan, that if we don't rebuild Endor, these fuzzy wuzzies, which by the way is what the British used to call the Afghans,
Yes, I know.
would turn into a haven for international terrorism. And of course it seems silly, but to do something like that. But is it any sillier than using zombies as a way to talk about the threads that hold civilization together? Because when I wrote Zombie Survival Guide, most people were just used to the Thriller video for zombies.
Mhm.
So for me, the cornerstone of my career is getting laughed at. So it's fine.
You can teach more with laughter than you can with almost anything else.
Well, also, I find that the best way is to get them laughing at it initially, and then later they go, oh yeah, maybe there's something there.
Yeah, it's the entry. Laughter is the entry drug, if you will, to wider concepts. So that that's a great point. I mean, yeah, my first, that was something I was looking at, being raised as the daughter of World War II veterans, that we've got all these wars going on, but that's not going to change minds and hearts. That's not creating allies. That's not creating a future.
No, I mean, what we failed to teach is that the reason we have such close allies in Germany and Japan is because it's about psychology and emotion. That in the 60s and 70s, the leaders of Germany and Japan were children in the 1940s. And when you say the word American, they think of the GIs who came in and were friendly and helpful and saved their parents and rebuilt their homes. There's some wonderful, one of my favorite war photographs ever is from Okinawa. And I don't know whether it's a soldier or a Marine, but kneeling down to give an old Okinawan woman a cup of water as they're about to take her onto a hospital ship. That was our real victory. And I don't know why we lost this. Maybe it was greed. Maybe it was selfishness. Maybe it was just forgetting history, but we have forgotten it. All my friends in USAID are saying that that's the key. And lest we forget that, the Chinese and the Russians haven't, because as this plague is still sweeping the globe, they are practicing full-throated vaccine diplomacy, right? They are going around the world vaccinating anyone they can because they know the children they vaccinate today will be the leaders of tomorrow and will be their friends forever.
Mm-hmm. Oh yes. Oh yes. Yeah, we have a lot to make, a lot of making up and recouping to do. On a somewhat lighter note, maybe not, what are, we don't have everybody here. Unfortunately, they couldn't all fit in the room and they weren't all available. But what are some of the other essays that you'd like to share with our audience today? Jaym, I'm going to start with you. Give us a couple. That's not to say they're your favorites or that they're the best or anything like that, but let's just talk about the scope of this project.
So one of the things I think I mentioned in one of my earlier bits was that we really wanted to look not just at hard and cold military strategy, like, how do you invade a world, but how do you look at all of the things around it? Because as Max just mentioned, there's so much more. There's the whole hearts and minds thing. And, there's supply chain, there's all of this. Andrew Liptak actually wrote a really great piece for the initial anthology that he went into some of that and talked about a lot of the sort of little things that get forgotten. And, one of the phrases is an army runs on its stomach and runs on its supply chain. And if you don't talk about those things, you're really missing out on a lot. it's something that I think that maybe military movies and pop culture in general kind of do a disservice to, is that it's all the front runners and the action and the shooting. There's this whole gigantic thing behind the scenes that's keeping all of that working. And if you cut that off, you're screwed. So we had a lot of people go in and look at some of those more specific things, at leadership, at what happens if that supply chain is cut, and what are some of the things that you need to be aware of around all of that. And I think that was what I really enjoyed, was that we had so many different perspectives coming in. And I mean, just reading those things was a huge education for me, and one of the best parts of the project.
Matt, what about you? What are some of the other things that you'd like to share with our audience about the book?
Absolutely. So one of the chapters is from now Colonel Erica Iverson, who wrote about the evolution of women's roles at war and how it mirrors what you can see on screen in the films. So in the very first scene in the very first Star Wars film that hit screens, we see Princess Leia, the quintessential damsel in distress, right? In that film, she had about 6% of the movie's lines. And at roughly the same time, when women joined the army, they were receiving a letter that said that when you take weapons training, it is to familiarize yourself with the weapon so as that you're not terrified of it, not so that you can take aim at enemy combatants, and that's putting it charitably. Fast forward 40 years and Princess Leia is General Leia. The protagonist has gone from Luke to Rey, from male to female. Even the mentor figure, it has female characteristics. And so, and similarly, in the real world, women are on nuclear submarines. They are completing Army Ranger School. They are 4-star generals that are defending the homeland from attack. And so I think that I love that essay. There are others. So for example, Chuck Beese, who's also an Army officer, picks apart that fantastic scene of whether or not Han shot first and uses that as a mechanism for explaining the difference between preventive and preemptive war, which matters a whole hell of a lot here in the United States, particularly with respect to our recent past in Iraq. Brown University has estimated that the post 9/11 wars cost $6 trillion out through 2050 through veterans, including veteran spending. That's not to mention the lives that are lost. And so these decisions are the highest stakes, and we've got to find a way in to educating more people on these crucial decisions, because they're picking the leaders that will make them. Admiral James Stavridis, former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, wrote a piece about hybrid wars in space. And then August Cole, who we mentioned earlier, he's a former journalist, a recovering journalist, fiction author now. But
we never entirely recover.
That's right. That's right. No offense intended. But what he tried to do was envision what future war might be like for a war correspondent, through the eyes of a war correspondent. So he sort of creates a character who embeds in the Battle of Hoth, and for me that was really interesting. And he based it on Ernie Pyle, So I mean, there's some really great stuff that you can tease out here, and these are some really engaging, informative, interesting essays that I was really excited to have as part of the whole smorgasbord.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and definitely. If you, what about you, Theresa? What if you couldn't choose your own essay? What would you like to bring forward to the viewers of this particular program? You know, what do you want them to point at, and what do you want to point at and say, yeah, but don't forget this?
Well, I think many of the ones that I would have pointed to, the individual essays have been mentioned. What I thought was really interesting about the way the book was set out was something that Matt didn't mention, and it's how they did the different parts. So you have a society and war part, and I read every essay in that section, and that was really interesting because, again, thinking from the viewpoint of your teaching strategy at a military college, that end you don't necessarily see that often, that piece, and being taught to young soldiers or sailors or airmen, and I think that's really important. So that made me happy, and it made me happy that it was the first part of the book, not the last, not an add-on, not, you know, oh, we should have thought of this. It actually kicks off the book, and frankly, I thought that was really well done. And then they did it kind of in chronological order from there: preparation for war, waging a war, assessment of war, and that was good too. But I was really happy that it started with society and war.
Max?
Now I'm blanking on who wrote this. Matt, was it Steve Leonard who talked about the insulation of the Jedi?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I think that was my favorite. This notion that the Jedi had become this very insulated body that was sort of out of touch with the rest of society, which gave way to sort of arrogance and groupthink, which honestly I think it perfectly mirrors where we are right now with the U.S. military. But I think that's as much all of our fault as everything else, because nobody wants to get involved, nobody wants to do anything. And because we have taken away over time the connections that all of us have, and I'm not saying we got to reinstitute the draft, and that would be a disaster on every single level. But when you don't have a war bonds, when you don't even have a war tax, when you don't have rationing, when you don't have any reminder that you're at war, why shouldn't Afghanistan go on for 20 years? Why shouldn't it go on for 30 years? If it's just something on TV where it's not your kid and you can just turn it off, why not? I remember when I was asked to speak at a strategic studies group at the Pentagon, and I said, look at the top 40 songs the year after 9/11. Remember, they said 9/11 changed everything. It changed everything. I said, look at the top 40 songs. Not one about 9/11. I said, if you were a cultural anthropologist or if you were a historian and you went back and all you had to go on was pop culture, 9/11 never happened, right? Friends, #1 TV show in America, took place in New York. Never mentioned it. None of the sitcoms mentioned it. The Onion maybe mentioned it, and Spider-Man mentioned it. And that was it. So I love this notion that the Jedi had become this sort of elite body that was sort of entranced with its own eliteness. And because it's a hierarchy, it all depends on this one guy at the top, which was Yoda, who we have the chapter. Yoda was a bad strategist, which I think is very, very dangerous, because we need to check each other, Civ and Mill.
And there is a definite difference between strategy and tactics, which is not always understood at large. So, yeah. Out of curiosity, what do are you all fans of Star Wars, or did you just get stuck with Star Wars because there was nothing else to watch in this one hotel room in Korea? Did you come to this as fans of the franchise or one of the films in it? Starting with you, Theresa?
As I said before, yes, I'm a fan. I mean, I remember standing in line for the first movie. I've been a science fiction and fantasy reader from the time I was a small child, and Star Wars came out the year I graduated from high school, so it was a big deal at the time, and I was really entranced by it and by the concepts around it. I was also a big reader of Greek myths. And you see kind of the arc of the myth, the hero, the arc of the hero.
Yeah, the hero's journey, yes.
Hero's journey, yeah, in the trilogy. And I thought in many ways that it was a modern take on that hero's journey, and it was well done if you look at it from that perspective. It was interesting, and it had all the bells and whistles and all the fun parts. But at its core, it was the hero's journey, and that was something when you're just graduating from high school that probably strikes you fairly as fairly important, because you're beginning your journey as a person in a way. And so I think it was effective in that way. I still like the franchise. I mean, but if you ask me to choose, I'm going to choose Star Trek over Star Wars any day. Don't tell anybody.
I see another book looming. Matt, what about you? Before your epic viewing in Korea, were you a fan?
So first of all, I'm of an age where you can't escape it.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of hit center mass for all of the films, like,
Mm-hmm.
to have the money and freedom to be able to walk into a movie theater, which is something hopefully we'll be able to do again shortly. I think I've done it for all of them, in fact, actually, and one of them I actually saw in Korea. Now, what's interesting is that I loved the original trilogy, but when I went back and watched the George Lucas second trilogy, the second second
Yes.
batch, which were not as good movies, but they did provide a heck of a lot more fodder for connecting to strategy to the real world. And there were some amazing lines in there. I've heard Max mention several times, that fantastic line, "This is how democracy dies," to thunderous applause. For me, it was watching that arc, from episode 1, where the Republic and the Jedi are in power and rule, and then watching the arc to the episode 3, where the Republic falls and the Jedi are literally 2 heartbeats away from extinction. To me, watching it with my camouflage on and my military goggles on, that's striking, right? And I mentioned earlier, I have a 9 and a 6-year-old daughter, and there's actually kind of a funny moment where I said, "Oh, maybe it was a couple years ago. Look what's on television. It's Star Wars." And it happened to be the moment where young Darth Vader, Hayden Christensen, legless, like armless, is like sliding into the molten lava. It's like the most violent and gruesome and disgusting moment in like probably all of the movies. And so my kids are afraid of the movies now a little bit. So I'm going to have to kind of reboot that. We're going to have to come back to this in a few years, I think, when they're older. But anyways, yeah, I'm a fan. I'm not a deep fan, but I am definitely a fan.
Max?
I'm a huge fan. And I will echo what Matt said, is that I think the prequels need a second look, because I think, my generation, Gen X, we got so angry. We'd been waiting so long that I think we were let down by Jar Jar Binks. But I think we need to look beyond that, especially now that the last 3 movies were just corporate retreads. They said nothing. They meant nothing. They were empty calories. Whereas the prequels, I think, are critical now more than ever to us as a democracy, as a republic, especially what's been happening lately. We need to be very conscious of how democracy dies, because we're in trouble, and we need to get back to what does it mean about a government of the people. The problem is that storytellers can take the public in either direction. Our founders, thank God, they had the records, they had the stories of ancient Rome, and they understood how the Republic went sour, and which gave the rise to the dictator Julius Caesar. But that almost got derailed by another storyteller, William Shakespeare, who tried to elevate Caesar because he was trying to kiss the ass of the monarchy. And so he was writing a play about the good king, the good dictator. No. Had Shakespeare not written that, had he gone the other way and made Cicero the hero, the Republic the hero, well, he probably would have gotten his head cut off. But
Survival generally.
right, but that is the issue, is the story. We need the storytellers, especially now when in a republic, we are the boss. We are the voter. We are the taxpayer. So I think those prequels need to be looked at again to illustrate how a government by the people surrenders its own power to the dictator.
Yeah, and in January, we had a rather scary moment of that.
Yeah.
Yes. And that phrase was on many people's lips. This is how democracy dies. Yeah, very, very telling.
Lucas had so much to give in those movies, and I don't think we gave it its fair shake. But like I said, just as our founders had the great Roman historians, we have these, and this is how we need to tell these stories. You're not going to get the average citizen to read ancient Roman history about Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. But if we keep telling these kinds of stories, we got a shot at preserving this experiment.
Yes, as Ben Franklin said on the after the Constitution was signed, somebody said to him, "Well, you've got a republic now, Ben. What do you think? If only we can keep it."
Yeah.
Or words I'm misquoting, but that's the theme. Okay, Jaym, what about you?
So I have to admit that I've actually never seen the prequels. I'm in an interesting position. I saw the first 3 movies when I was about 13. I grew up very conservatively Christian, very, very right wing. My family did not believe that science fiction and fantasy were good. They were of the devil. So it took me a little while to get caught up on some pop culture things. But I was 13 and I was doing one of the very rare sleepovers that I was allowed at my best friend's house. And this is the friend that I, mentioned earlier in personal discussion, that we were driving through Nevada and she was reading, stories about pox to me. But we watched all 3 movies, and something about it just really set off our thinking, and we started talking about cause and effect and causality and all of these things. And I never actually, it was years until I can't interact with Star Wars at all, actually. But when the new movies came out, I kind of went to see them just because friends were. I wasn't really a big fan of them. I was much more a Star Trek person. And I watched the first of the new movies to come out, and I remember thinking, now I'm a Star Wars fan. I see myself represented here. There are things here that I actually relate to and understand. Like, I worked extensively with the protests last year, and seeing the most recent of the movies, I was sitting in the theater and it was like, I'm really surprised that this got through Disney. Like, I am actually shocked that some of these themes have come through, because this is a movie about the resistance. This is about pushing back fascism, about taking responsibility, diversity, and the need to listen to underrepresented populations. Like, I know that movie got trashed a lot, but there was so much to unpack about it that it was really, really that moment where I went from, I really like Star Wars, to I am a fan of this and I really want to see this going forward. So it's been a while coming, but when we started the book, I liked it. I was a fan. Now I would say I am definitely a fan.
Cool. Very cool. And Strategy Strikes Back is not the end of the story here. I believe there is a sequel that takes on Game of Thrones. Can somebody tell me a little bit about that?
Matt.
Well, yeah, I'll jump on that. It was essentially the recognition that we had just finished this project, and the final season of Game of Thrones was about to kick off. And so when you looked at the clock and the calendar, we really spotted an opportunity. And so having done it once, it makes it a little easier to do it a second time, although that's not always the case. And one thing, it would be, this wasn't herding cats. It was like something worse, you know, in the sense that when we did it the second time, the timetable was smashed down to very, you know, almost nothing. We had about half the writers come back, which was fantastic. But you know, when you look at something like Game of Thrones, it's another opportunity to use pop culture. So we again centered our discussion on the series, which was the most popular television series at the time. And we allowed a little bit of play to get into some of George R.R. Martin's fantastic stories on which the show is based. But, you know, it's just too great and big a story to ignore, in the sense that you have this proximate threat, but you also have this distant threat in the White Walkers. And, you know, what you can't see in front of you right now can still kill you. And I think that, like, as a meta theme or a very important consideration, whether you're talking about the current unpleasantness, which emanated from far away, or whether you're talking about the shift in the climate. You know, we've just passed Earth Day, which is our annual point at which we sort of look at how bad things are going. You know, so for me, it was just an opportunity that was too good to pass up. Very difficult to pull off, and I was really glad to have been a part of the second go for it.
Cool. Okay, good. And with that, we're sort of coming up on the end of our time together. So I'm going to ask you all, you know, to describe a bit of your current projects and where folks can find you on the web. So I'm going to start with you, Max.
Well, I've had 2 books come out within a year of each other. I was trying to write a book about what happens with our over-reliance on technology and interdependence without building up any resilience. But I'm telling it through a Sasquatch attack story called Devolution.
Okay. I like that.
Like I said, PowerPoint, put them to sleep, piss them off, or scare them away. But give them a good Bigfoot attack story, and maybe at the last page they go, oh my God, yeah, I don't know how anything in my house works. I wouldn't know when it all turns off. So that's one book, Devolution. And then another one is I've been writing these series of Minecraft books because I really think that this simplistic video game has the ability to prepare young people's minds for the gig economy and to sort of break this industrialized Prussian model of education, which just does not work anymore. We are essentially training our kids to be replaced by machines. But once again, how are you going to do it? TED Talk or a video game they're already playing, which is Minecraft.
And your website, where they can find you on the web?
You can go to maxbrooks.com. You can always look at it, or, you know, go on one of them book sites and just punch in my name, and I'm sure something's going to come up, usually with a 1-star review of someone saying, dude, that was an epic fail. So yeah,
get enough of those and you basically shoot the algorithm anyway. So
it means you're in the game.
You got it. Okay, Matt, what you working on now, and where can folks find you?
So I have a full-time job, so writing is a secondary occupation, but they can find anything that I've written at mlcavanaugh.com. You know, but there's intersections between what I do in my day job and what I bring home with me. So I'm starting up a small think tank at the Air Force Academy called the Homeland Defense Institute, because really in this the current era of destructive technology getting as cheap as it is, North Korea's GDP is roughly the same as Colorado Springs, and they can afford intercontinental ballistic missile technology. What's most valuable is now most vulnerable. And so, you know, some of those ideas translate into my off-the-job writing. I'm writing a weekly newsletter, strategynotes.co, and then the work with the Modern War Institute. And about a year from now, I intend on retiring from the military. growing out my hair incredibly long, a full beard, and you'll see a cloud of marijuana smoke around me. But most importantly, I'll be plucking away at the keyboard, because I think the world of what fiction writers do, and I see the power and importance of it.
Yes. And you said earlier that you've got something on NPR?
Yeah, so I do a weekly audio essay for the local NPR affiliate. It's about the Colorado Springs area, but could be listened to more broadly. It's almost like just a perspective essay, kind of my softer side, I guess.
Okay. Is there a URL for that?
Yeah, just go to krcc.org.
krcc.org.
Yeah,
okay.
You can find it on my personal site as well, and you can hear my my deep, rich voice, reading it off. Occasionally, it does sound a little bit like a prepubescent teenager, but I do my best.
Hey, sometimes that can't be helped. Okay, Theresa, what are you working on now, and where can folks find you on the web?
Well, I have a full-time job as a journalist these days, so my stuff is up on the Breaking Defense website, which is www.breakingdefense.com. I also, though, just finished another essay for a third strategy book looking at science fiction called To Boldly Go. And
cool.
That is also some of the same gang here, not everybody, but some of the same. And it's going to be coming out in the fall. So I had a lot of fun with that, writing an essay on the expanse as a cautionary tale for how humankind goes forth into the solar system and the universe beyond. So that was super fun. Keep an eyeball out for it. I think it's actually up on Amazon for pre-order at this time. I hope that folks continue with this series because it's a real creative outlet for me. And I've enjoyed getting to know the folks involved in working with them.
Okay, To Boldly Go. That sounds like Star Trek to me. Talking about humans in the solar system, just this week, they managed to make oxygen out of CO2 on Mars, and I'm going, we're already terraforming the solar system. This cannot be good. Anyway, Jaym, what about you? What are you working on, and where can we find you?
So I also have a full-time day job. So a lot of my writing energy is actually caught up with tech documentation. But I've been working more on getting back into some of the consulting sort of things. So like I mentioned in my intro, I'm working with a group of folks that I've worked with in the past from very disparate areas, looking at some of the issues with things like terraforming Mars and space and ethics and AI. One of my big sadnesses about the pandemic was that I was supposed to be in Montreal last year working on things, leading some wargaming about AI and futurism. So I'm hoping to get more into stuff like that. I'm kind of dusting off some of my old community crisis response work, which started with the California wildfires and has become more and more relevant as we've gone forward. So not much in the way of writing these days, a little bit in board games, a little bit for RPGs, but generally more on the consulting side and kind of the behind the scenes stuff.
So that's very cool. And do you have a website?
I do. I really should update it one of these days. The better place to find me is probably on Twitter, and it's just at Jaym Gates.
At Jaym Gates. Okay. Well, thank you. I will make sure that all of this is included in the credits, because I know that our audience is going to want to read more about the issues you've raised here today. I was very thrilled at the conversation, and frankly, it got a lot deeper than I expected, but I'm glad for that. And so thank you, and thank you out there. This is Jean Marie Ward for Continual Convention. Happy May the 4th.